With everybody's permission, we will record today's meeting. Today is April 28th, 2021. You're a guest of the Rotary Club of New York, host club number 6. And we're very much delighted that you can join us tonight for our 9th Youth Empowerment Session. I would defer to Bowler to start the meeting, as she has so diligently put this meeting together. And as I will put myself in mute, I will call upon our president to hopefully join the meeting very quickly. Bowler, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you so much, everyone. Good evening, distinguished Rotarians and our guest speakers and our guests. And I'm very happy, glad to have a conversation today as impacts of ESG on business and consumer behavior outlook with wonderful speakers, Chris Terry and Jonathan Levov. Both sessions will be moderated by New York City Global Shaper Maggie Carrick, due to very unfortunate situation happening to Isabel's family. And I appreciate Maggie for her flexibility and openness. Long story short, and Chris, I'm gonna make the introduction very briefly, depends on because of timing. Chris Terry has advised corporate, NGO, and government clients headquartered across Europe, Americas, and Asia and Middle East. And his areas of strategic counseling include reputation management, public affairs, crisis and issues management, allocation branding, corporate responsibility and sustainability. He serves as a president of Teneo Digital Advisory. Prior to joining Teneo, Chris served as a president of WCG and Chinese market leader at Burson Marsteller. He's one of the very first young global leaders of the World Economic Forum. Next session, we're going to focus on impacts of consumer behavior outlook, and Professor Jonathan Levov has been very kind enough to join us within his class today, and he will join shortly around 7:30. And Professor Jonathan Levov and he is a professor of marketing at Stanford Graduate School of Business and faculty director, Stanford Behavioral Lab. His research is aimed at understanding consumers' judgments and choices by using tools from experimental psychology and behavioral economics. In particular, he studies the contextual factors that influence people's choice and judgments. His research is both basic and applied, from probability judgment to product customization and decisions. And our very own Maggie from New York Global Shapers Hub, and Maggie works as a management consultant at Accenture, helping to build the newly established responsible retail practice. And Maggie works to strategically embed environmental, social, and governance factors across business functions to manage risks, process efficiency, and revenue growth, and resiliency planning. We'll have 20 minutes each moderated sessions and 10 minutes Q&A with both speakers, and please type your questions on the chat box, and Maggie and I'll ask your questions from the speakers. And these sessions will be recorded and participants would be muted automatically. Thank you so much, and I'm gonna hand it over to Maggie, please.
Thank you, Bowler and Andres, for having us. We're so delighted to be here. So as Bowler mentioned, Chris is the Senior Managing Director at Teneo, a global advisory firm that works exclusively with CEOs and senior executives from the world's leading companies to provide strategic counsel across the full range of environmental, social, and governance issues. As Bowler already teased out, Chris has been advising clients on ESG topics for 20 plus years, and also helping NGOs engage with corporations. So delighted to be in conversation with Chris today. So I'll just jump right in. Chris, you're an early pioneer of sustainability and driving large scale businesses to act as globally minded corporate statesmen and women. Today, environmental, social, and governance factors have become table stakes, but it's a journey. It's been quite a journey to get here. So how has communication of these topics evolved since you've gotten started? What's been a little bit of the evolution that you've seen, and what yes, let me stop there.
Sure. Hi. Well, nice to see everybody. Thanks for having me. You know, I've been working on these issues for 20 years now, and I think that the evolution question is an interesting one. You know, when topics, it was, you know, a lot of different words in this space: corporate responsibility, sustainability, ESG, citizenship. When topics of a company's responsibility came up 20 years ago, it was usually, you know, a crisis management situation. It was usually in the context of a company being criticized for something. You know, companies have long been criticized for what occurred sort of inside their own four walls. But, you know, as we saw globalization really change in part and significantly a company's supply chain, and with multiple partners all over the world and multiple layers, you started to see, you know, world-class companies and well-known brands being held accountable for what was happening in their supply chain. And the basic fact is it was really hard for companies to keep track of what was happening in their supply chain. And so there was a lot of, you know, talk of child labor, talk of environmental degradation was usually something that was happening in the supply chain. The brand, the well-known corporate name was criticized. There was a lot of scrambling to, you know, explain what they were responsible for, what they weren't responsible for, but it was basically in the context of a crisis. The evolution of that was companies started to recognize, well, of course they want to avoid being criticized, but they saw a reputational opportunity to be seen as responsible, to be seen as even leading on some of these issues. But the real business case at that point was largely reputational, and it was certainly voluntary, whether it was behaviors and acts or the ways in which the companies were transparent about their performance on these issues. It was all, you know, voluntary. It was seen as a strategy that could, you know, drive goodwill with any number of stakeholders, perhaps customers, employees, government officials, not in a regulatory context, but just, you know, to be seen as a good citizen. If you fast forward, and that's fast forwarding over a lot, you know, the debate today, interestingly, I mean, I call it the Larry Fink effect, which is basically, you know, sort of hard-nosed mainstream investors have said these topics matter. Of course, they matter from a, you know, a risk management standpoint, but they matter from a value creation standpoint. And so that's what's driving a lot of the discussion now. That's what's driving huge capital flows. And that's what's driving companies to further embed a lot of their practices and their strategies related to these issues really into the center of their company. So I think it's all good news. And then the last factor is that where this stuff had, you know, very much been in the realm of the voluntary and the strategic, much of it is moving to the regulated, right? And so we're seeing, you know, regulators in the US, in Europe, and in Asia just start to call on companies to address these issues, manage these issues, perform at a certain level against these issues, simply, you know, from a kind of regulatory and compliance standpoint.
Chris, what have been key drivers accelerating ESG as a CEO and a board priority? Obviously, you meant Larry Fink, chairman of BlackRock, and of course, his letter sends a ripple effect through every industry. What other kind of key drivers do you see as being the key accelerants?
Well, so again, I think, you know, CEOs pay a lot of attention to their investors. They pay a lot of attention to regulators. So those are driving them. I think the question that I have is, to what extent, especially for consumer-facing companies, to what extent are consumers and consumer mindset and consumer preference driving their decisions? And this has been a question I'm eager to hear our next speaker talk about it, because obviously he's got incredible expertise and insight into this. You know, I've watched this for 20 years, and, you know, the sort of human response is nobody wants to buy, you know, a demonstrably unethical or unsustainable product, right? That's kind of easy. But I don't think the code has been cracked amongst the mainstream of consumers about what added value consumers will assign to, you know, sustainable products and brands. Again, they will seek out sustainable products and brands as a particular attribute. But in terms of the core value proposition of, you know, that product on the shelf next to others that may or may not have it, I haven't seen that code get cracked again for the mainstream consumer. So I'm still watching.
You're teasing out some of my questions for later.
Oh, sorry.
Which is perfect. Yeah, I just would add in, so at Accenture, we're just finishing up a research study with a global study of consumers. And I think probably one of the most blaring pieces, it was focused specifically in apparel and accessories, just to understand more specifically what they're interested in. But I think probably to no surprise of our team was, you know, ultimately sustainability fell to the bottom of the list in terms of, right, you know, price and fit and all that stuff was rose is kind of, you know, obviously more important. But when we started to dig into the why, we found over 50% of consumers don't engage with sustainability at all because they find claims to be misleading, confusing, complex. So I am equally as interested to hear Jonathan's take as well. And so a little bit on that same note, how is stakeholder capitalism driving complexity and opportunity for CEOs and their companies? Obviously, there's a range of topics that one needs to manage today. So what are you seeing just in terms of how active, right, our communities are today on a lot of these different issues?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I mean, so in a lot of ways, the non-financial and non-investor stakeholders, you know, are sort of like the dog who caught the car that they were chasing, right? They've been talking about this for years and for decades, and they've been, you know, engaging with companies, railing against companies, you know, holding good leading companies up on a platform. But now again, when you go back to mainstream investors and regulators achieving carbon neutrality, right? In terms of the pace, in terms of the methods, in terms of, you know, using offsets, whatever it is. So we've got a lot more attention from a broader set of stakeholders. But, you know, for those of us, you know, who are advising companies, you know, it's always been a challenge to balance the interests, the expectations, the aspirations, and the criticisms of different stakeholders in general, when it's on the same issue across such a broad set of stakeholders now, right? I think it brings an incredible amount of added complexity for leaders. And I think that it will also become much more complex for boards. I think that right now, you know, maybe a little bit unfairly, I think this is quite simplistic in terms of board engagement overall. Number one, boards, you know, want to make sure you're doing no harm. Okay, that's part of their responsibility. And they want to know what the business's strategy is and how, you know, value will be protected and created for shareholders. And then they've got the subcommittees on, you know, more and more boards have ESG focused subcommittees. But I think that most of it is, again, looking at risk management and then looking at very one-dimensional sort of bottom line performance as relates to these issues. And I'm not sure how stakeholder capitalism drivers are being considered at the board level.
I think probably you, like us, get the same question, just which reporting framework, right? If we just start
That can take up a whole board meeting.
Yeah, we could probably talk for the next 40 minutes, if I'm honest, about that alone, the reporting approaches. So, right, we know investors, of course, aren't all stakeholders, or not the only stakeholders that care. Consumers want to align their shopping habits with their values. Employees want to work for purpose-driven companies. But everyone these days, right, I think as we all watched in the Super Bowl, is selling that feel-good story. So how do you break through the noise? What is, you know, those that are getting the most credit, if you will, what are some of those best practices in telling an authentic story and it being heard? We know it takes such a heavy lift just to gather the information to tell the stories.
Right. So I'll break down your question: being trusted and being heard, connected but distinct. Being trusted is really easy. You want to be trusted, tell the truth. And the way you do that is transparency. You know, companies and companies get this. You need to be the source of credible information about the good, the bad, and the ugly of your own company's performance, your footprint, your imprint, all of those things. And it's really the same approach as companies take to traditional investor relations, right? If you don't have the trust of the street and of your investors, when you have a bad quarter, they're not going to trust that you're going to turn it around, and when you have a good quarter, they're not going to trust you when you say why you're going to sustain it. So you've got to be transparent in order to be trusted. Being heard, that's more complicated, and I think that companies come to us all the time and they say, oh, we have such a fantastic story that we want to, that we've done so much, we have a great story to tell. The fact is that companies have worked hard at a lot of these things. They have a lot of accomplishments, but communicating about things you've already done are really never going to break through the noise. What's going to break through the noise is when you look ahead and you make sort of, man to the moon type commitments that are scary, audacious, and could have real impact, and you may not even know exactly how you're going to achieve them. Amazon has taken out television ads saying, we're going to do everything we can, to achieve carbon neutrality, and we don't know exactly how we're going to do it. But making those bold public commitments and then holding yourself accountable and being transparent about your performance, that's one way. But the other way is companies think of themselves as performance organizations, right? In terms of their processes, in terms of their products, in terms of their practices. I think that the way that companies, and we're seeing it already, especially in the last year in the United States with the social justice movement, things like that, companies need to become advocacy organizations. People want to know where companies stand ideologically on some of the most important societal issues, many of which become political issues, right? Now, companies can't become political advocacy organizations, but they need to become advocacy organizations about these issues. Their employees want to know where their companies stand. A lot of times, the local communities where they operate, including politicians want to know where they stand. In some instances, investors want to know where they stand. So companies need to become advocacy organizations, not just on behalf of their own interests, but on behalf of what is of interest and importance to society at large. And that's, especially for global companies, there's actually one factor, which is we're seeing more and more that's going to get in their way, and that's China. If you go back to the Olympics in 2008, corporate sponsors experienced a new pressure and expectation for the first time. Olympic sponsors always got pressured. Hey, sportswear maker, where are you making your stuff? And Coca-Cola, what's the refrigerants that you're using? In 2008, companies were called upon to advocate directly to and about the Chinese government, about the Chinese government's own domestic and foreign policies, right? And to be a force for good, to influence the Chinese government. And that continued. What, of course, we've seen in the last number of years is a much more strong, front-footed approach on China's behalf about their own policy decisions and their own absolute lack of interest in what anybody thinks about their policy decisions. And now what we're seeing, of course, in many instances right now is, companies being pressured to take action about, particular issues in China. I mean, there's all sorts of issues. There's the Uyghur issue. There's, the use of AI against its entire population. But, when companies do that, even when companies think they're avoiding doing that, we have seen China come down on them like a ton of bricks. And so, no global company can be truly global without having a presence in China. Companies are expected to be advocacy organizations. It is impossible for companies to be advocacy organizations in the context of any issues that matter to China. So it's going to become a lot more complex.
And we're seeing that in the apparel industry right now. Mm-hmm. You saw H&M, Nike got just sort of pushed right back on their back foot for making some points around cotton sourcing. The industry as a whole is trying to grapple with is there cotton being grown in forced labor environments, which nobody can say with confidence because the way that cotton leaves a farm, gets ginned and spin rates conveniently or inconveniently a dark supply chain. And I think just to your point, we saw folks take a strong stance and then immediately lose spokespeople from the China region, and a ton of backlash that forced folks to even have to shut stores down, things of that nature. So definitely a complex environment. So I do want to leave some time for questions, but just my final question for you, Chris, is what do you see as the next frontier of sustainability and really corporations' role in driving environmental, social, and governance practices?
Yeah, I think the next frontier is actually consumer behavior, right? I mean, if you do a life cycle analysis of Tide detergent, from sourcing the raw materials, manufacturing, transportation, putting it on the shelf, it getting bought, it getting used, materials being discarded. If you follow the climate impact of that entire life cycle, it's sort of a straight line, and then there is this one spike, and that spike is when the consumer turns on the hot water to wash their clothes with the detergent. And so, yes, there's cold water detergent, and it is marketed that way, and the benefits, but consumer behavior is going to have to change. When we talk about scaling impact, companies, corporations have massive scale, but consumers have even larger scale. So, what does that require of companies? Well, it might require companies to suggest that, consumers buy less of their products. Right? Don't buy a car, have partial car ownership. So these are, not just business model changing, challenges. This is, complete, macroeconomic changing challenges. And, companies are not always known for, bravery when it comes to, breaking incumbent business models that they've spent decades, sort of developing and mastering and protecting. So, but I think the next frontier is consumer behavior. And that's, where real change has to go.
We have a funny partner that says COVID was a dress rehearsal for what's to come with the climate crisis. So we'll can sort of come hell or high water. We'll see what we're willing to part ways with as consumers, right? If we have ecosystem collapses or extreme weather events that are going to prohibit, we'll see if we can change before the environment changes for us. Changes it for us. I just want to take a pause. Happy to welcome questions. Please take yourself off mute. Since we're a small group, it's easy enough to field those questions. If you're more comfortable dropping them into the chat, that's okay. So I'll just give 1 second. Otherwise, I have plenty. I could ask Chris questions all night. So as you're typing, I'll maybe tee up one more, Chris. So I'm going to ask maybe more of just a personal question. As we think, you've done incredible things throughout your career, really a pioneer of the movement. As you think about some of the big leaps and milestones that have advanced the sustainability movement, what are you most proud of?
I think getting companies to partner with their critics. That was something that it was, I had one experience a number of years back, a large Latin American forestry company whose biggest customer was Home Depot. And they grew radiata pine, which is, grown on plantations. It's not native to Chile. They were the target of a campaign against them about native Chilean trees. The fact of the matter is they weren't cutting down native Chilean trees because they weren't interested in the fiber. It wasn't good for their business, blah, 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 blah. But the CEO came to see us, laid out the issue, said it was, they were worried about it putting their relationship with Home Depot in danger. And we said, okay, well, once we got the facts, we said, well, why don't we call up that campaigning NGO and meet with them? And literally, they very, very politely sort of ended the meeting and said, well, thank you very much for your time. And they left. And we thought, okay, that's that. 3 or 4 months later, they literally showed up, sort of like on a Wednesday morning and said, are you available for, coffee this afternoon? Home Depot had told them to do the exact same thing. And the very long story made very short was they did engage them. There was transparency. There was a real discussion of issues. And at the end of the day, they ended up partnering with the NGO who literally had been attacking them for years on certifying a sustainable wood product. That's a really good story and outcome. They're not all that unmessy. But I think that just getting companies to listen, because I do think that most companies are managed by not just really smart people, but really ethical people who want to do the right thing. Getting them to listen to outside and to challenging perspectives, to me, has been the most fascinating and rewarding thing to watch.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Any questions from the group? I don't see anything in the chat yet, but if anybody's feeling bold enough to take themselves off mute.
Yes. Hi. My name is Natalia Ponomaryova. I'm head of ESG and Green Finance Department of the Belgium-Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce. And I have questions about the United States regulation, because Security Exchange Commission, they have plans to make mandatory reporting by TCFD. But European Union right now, they have big changes to non-financial reporting initiative. And it's coming not for the big public company, it's just going to the small and medium-sized businesses. And I know in the practice in the United States, medium and small-sized businesses don't have a lot of knowledge about the ESG and how important is it. Do you think it's possible to make cooperation with non-for-profit organization to making like courses, education courses for small and medium-sized businesses? And another question about the second opinion, because the second opinion from the Big Four, like Fitch and Moody's, it's cannot possible for the small and medium-sized businesses. Maybe they have opportunity to get the second opinion from the some kind of organization, non-for-profit organization. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll unpack that. A couple things. The whole idea of small and medium-sized businesses focusing on ESG topics. This has been something that, for the most part, the conventional wisdom has been, oh, well, you know, we're too small, we're young, we're growing, you know, so we can't focus on that. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have such a big impact. I think that, you know, because more and more small and medium-sized businesses are somehow finding a place in the market as social enterprises, either in terms of the products or services that they employ, or how they become an employer of choice and become competitive against larger companies as an employer. I think that they are more naturally finding reason with a compelling business case to focus on these issues. That's a general statement. I think another driver, though, is that many small and medium-sized businesses are part of the value chain of larger multinational businesses. And of course, one has to be, as you well know, the commission in Brussels is going to be requiring sort of supply chain, you know, verification and certain standards for any company doing business in Europe, right? So every company on this side of the Atlantic has just, you know, gotten themselves regulated at global headquarters by Brussels, which is okay. It's not the first time. So the other driver is that small and medium-sized businesses are going to be driven to the extent that they are part of the value chain of larger businesses. The point about reporting, I hope nobody's, reporting is a mess right now. I mean, that's a statement of the obvious. It's an absolute mess. You know, there's a soup full of acronyms and different standards and shades of gray difference and things like that. That is going to require an incredible shakeout, huge amounts of disruption. If the Big Four can do it, God bless them. You know, I don't know if they can. I don't know if I trust them either. But but it's really important, right? Because I mean, the principle, right? I remember when there was just the GRI, and the principle was, hey, we just need to, create an apples to apples standard so everybody can compare these things. And it's just metastasized into, a lot of important frameworks and things like that. But it's really a similar dynamic that Maggie was talking about consumer confusion. I mean, the last time I was keeping count, there were literally 200 different certifications for some sort of sustainable or ethical product. How can you make a decision? We're almost at the same place with reporting frameworks. I mean, how do I figure out, you know what I mean? Like how to just assess a company. So I think it requires a great shakeout is required of that. And I don't know how that happens.
I'll just add into that. The good thing is in some, and again, there's no shortage of frameworks, but the good news is we're seeing some partnerships, right, start to emerge. So you have the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, partnering with GRI. They have CDP, ECFD, right, all the a couple other folks around the table to try to shake these things out. But that's the biggest challenge for companies.
I'm being too cynical, Maggie.
No,
You're rightly more optimistic than I am. Yeah.
No, because I mean, it's right. It takes an enormous amount of effort just to collect the data, let alone figure out how to then communicate it out. And, at least I will keep drawing on the experience. I have an apparel and accessories background, if that's not obvious, but right, as the retailers, right, imagine you're a company, a brand that's, even just selling to Macy's and Nordstrom and Selfridges, and you're not only having to report out now to investors, but just generally through your sustainability report, but then now to Chris's point about, you may be a smaller supplier to a bigger supply chain or a bigger player, each of those folks are requesting their own set of information, kind of a thin slice of the same data, multiple times over. And so I do think we're there, there's an incredible amount of reporting fatigue. You have advocacy agencies, right, reaching out to do the same thing. Just on the phone with a retailer an hour ago with, lots of concerns of the validity of an organization that's coming after them and emailing them every 10 minutes about filling out a survey. So, I think we're at a moment where, right, the positive is that we, so many people care, but the real bottoming out here is there's a tipping point here that there's going to have to be that consolidation to get it back, under control. I see a hand raise.
Maggie, so we're considering the timeline. It's 33. Jonathan's here. We need to move on to, we can halt the, would you mind typing your questions, Olaf, please?
Just a very simple one, very easy. If you allow me this question.
I do apologize due to Jonathan is between his 20 minutes.
That's fine.
Timeline.
Bolar, don't worry about it.
Okay.
When people have a question, it's important that I'm good with it, and maybe I'll pick up on it afterwards when I talk.
Go ahead, Olaf.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, inspirational speech. Thank you. As I'm in banking, financial industries. What is the best company in financial industry when it comes to this topic, and what's the worst one and why?
Ooh, geez. I think the best company is not a client. I think that JP Morgan and Jamie Dimon. I think that Jamie Dimon, I'm not saying that I don't think this is not an assessment on every single practice of the company, but I think that Jamie has led JP Morgan understanding that business must have a very complex and three-dimensional relationship with society. He's very happy to disagree with people. I think he enjoys it, but he's up for the engagement and for looking at what it means for his business. The worst, and I'm probably coming off differently. I'm a lover of China. I've lived there a number of times over my life, involved with it professionally and personally. But the Chinese banks are, especially from a project finance perspective, really putting huge amounts of capital into major projects. They're not paying attention to any of this. And so that is creating a race to the bottom for unsustainable, large capital expenditures.
Thank you.
Welcome, Jonathan. We're so delighted to have you.
Pleasure.
Making the time tonight.
No, of course.
So Polar teased your introduction a little bit at the start, but just to just give everybody a refresh. So Jonathan's a professor of marketing at Stanford Graduate School of Business. His research is aimed at understanding customers' judgments and choices by using tools from experimental psychology to behavioral economics. In particular, he studies the contextual factors that influence people's decisions and judgments. His research is both basic and applied, from probability judgment to product customization decisions. So Jonathan, we have, I think the consumer element always comes up. So just to kind of kickstart us, many of our habits have changed during COVID-19. Which of these new patterns and behaviors do you think are here to stay, and which do you think will return to kind of the pre-COVID ways of consumer behaviors?
So I mean, bearing in mind, you're asking the guy that was convinced that Bitcoin would be total bullshit. I'm making, and by the way, I'm still not sure it isn't, but I also, as my friend, I have a friend in finance who says, yeah, it's a total bubble, but I wouldn't short it. so that tells you, look, I think if you look at sort of classic consumer decision-making process, you have, awareness followed by consideration followed by decision. And I think what happened with a lot of consumer behaviors is that we either weren't aware of them in our life pre-COVID, and we became aware of them as possibilities post-COVID or during COVID, or we were aware of them, but we didn't consider them pre-COVID, but COVID forced us to consider them. And so now that we consider them, now they're under consideration set of decisions. And once, 78% of variance in decision-making is explained by what's in the consideration set. So the most obvious example is purchasing groceries online. People maybe were aware of it before, but COVID made people very aware of it and made people, made that be something viable. I'm old school. I still need to feel my fruits before I buy them. But for a lot of, a lot of people who are otherwise quite old school people, and I'm talking about not just old school in terms of their, attitude and orientation, but just old, forget old school, even just old, no school, all of a sudden kind of shifted those behaviors. And I don't think those things are going to shift back. Like, I don't think you're going to see all of a sudden people just did this massive shift towards going to retail locations to make purchases that you've now gotten used to buying online. Habits die hard. One of the hardest thing to do is to create a habit in people. And one of the other hardest thing to do is to actually change a habit that people already have. And so we had this precipitating event that forced us to change our habits. There was this external shock that forced us to change our habits. And now, the shelter in place was this sudden big boom thing, forced us to change. The unfolding of the economy is something that is gradual, right? And so there isn't a precipitating event where all of a sudden one day I wake up and I say, okay, I'm gonna go buy shoes at the shoe store, in the way that I had to start buying shoes on Zappos because I couldn't go to a shoe store because the shoe store was closed. And so I think that all these trends that you see and changes, and like there's just the explosion of e-commerce in the last year. I think they're here to stay. I think the 1 hour flight for the meeting and the 10-hour flight for the 1 hour meeting in Seoul is probably not going to happen anymore. I think people realize that this is a viable alternative. I think in education, we're discovering that online is not a replacement, but it's a viable way to create a meaningful experience for some segment of consumers that we weren't reaching before. And so I think that's there. I think, some people think that video interactions are gonna replace all kinds of in-person. Scott Galloway likes to say, oh, the real old school ivory tower universities are dead. Everything is going to be online. He created this company, to do this exec ed online. The big tech companies are going to be leading education. I think that's total baloney. It ignores the fact that human beings want to be together. They have a need to belong. It ignores the magic that happens in face-to-face communication. To say that this form of communication is going to replace all, in-person communication is like saying that porn replaces sex. It doesn't. It just, fills a need in some specific times. But you still can't make babies that way, just to be as blunt as I can possibly be. But I think that the cost benefit trade-offs of meeting in person are going to change a bit. And we were incurring massive costs before, both personally to our bodies, financially, to the environment. And I think some of that actually is kind of here to stay. And what I hope is that the technology platforms that enable this kind of communication actually improve, as opposed to what they are right now, which I think is it's actually pretty terrible if you think about it from just like a human communication perspective. So that's what I would say. I think the other type of behaviors that you're going to see that I think are permanent changes are going to be work environments that are going to be, that's an obvious one. It was already a trend. If you look at the trend of working from home, at least partially in the United States, it would look like a trend that was going like this, right? The graph was just exhibiting massive growth, except that growth took you from 0% to 5%. I think when we come out of this, we're coming out at 25 or 30 or 40 or 50%. And I think we're going to go into an era in which people are going to, and to some degree, to the extent that employers allow for hybrid work environments, people will feel, actually, it'll return their sense of control over their work, because they'll be able to decide, hey, where do I want to be? When do I want to be there? And kind of generally people that feel control and mastery over their environment are happier. So there's actually a potential that once we peel away the fact that we have to do this because the external, governments forced it on us, that it actually becomes a choice. I think it's going to affect a lot of people in actually a pretty positive way. So those are my guesses.
The real existential question is, are we going to want to get out of our sweatpants and get into an office, or are we going to want to still take those meetings from home? I know I personally am very anxious to get back into an office and need a little bit of that social interaction. So I know that there's the great degree of variance on preference for sure.
Yeah.
So, right, every consumer study says, right, consumers care about sustainability. There's often that gap between the intention and the execution of their actual shopping behaviors. From your research, what are kind of some of the key consumer trends that you're seeing towards sustainability and responsible consumption, and what's maybe driving some of those, just from a background or a contextual perspective?
So I actually disagree with the basic premise that consumers care about sustainability. I just don't think that's true. I think that you just, if you look at it like an economist, as you look at what revealed preferences are, and you're asked, I'm sure you care about sustainability, but I bet if I did an audit of your behaviors, about 95% of your behaviors are not sustainable. The only person who truly,
that's absolutely true. I am selectively sustainable, right?
Yeah, exactly. Look, the only person who actually truly believes in sustainability is Greta Thunberg. Like, the only person who's going to get on a boat instead of an airplane that's someone that really cares. I think the empirical evidence is that people aren't willing to pay for it. And so I don't see evidence that people care about sustainability. I see evidence that people know more about issues that relate to sustainability. This isn't the 50s anymore. We're aware of these things. There's more movies about it. I just saw the movie Seaspiracy, and now when I go and buy fish, I'm like, oh my God, like I just, oh no, the bycatch and the plastic and all that kind of stuff. But let me tell you actually a funny interaction that I had the other day at Whole Foods in Los Altos here in the Bay Area, in the Silicon Valley area. There's no like more woke, sustainable, loving, green, blah, blah environment more than this one. And so I was standing in line at a Whole Foods to buy salmon. I was like, you know what? Maybe I'll make exception. I'm gonna, despite having seen the movie, I feel like I need to feed my kids fish. And so I asked the guy, hey, has anyone talked to you at all about the movie Seaspiracy? And the movie had been out for at least a month. he told me, he said, "You're the first customer who's brought it up." And at first I thought he was being sarcastic. It's like, my dad's a psychiatrist, and if I had $1 for every time somebody asked me some question, oh, did he ever psychoanalyze or any of that kind of stuff, I'd be Bitcoin rich right now. And so I was sure he was actually asking me that's the question. He was being sarcastic in that same way. And actually, I was the very first human being who came to that store, to the fish market part of Whole Foods, who would ask the question. And so that suggests to me that people actually don't care so much. And it's obvious why they don't care so much is because my consumption affects something that's both very, very diffuse. It affects everybody. You know, it's kind of a bit of a tragedy of the commons. And it also is going to affect the world much further down the line. So it's not like immediate. And by the way, Joseph Stern, Farm Raised, actually is, you should see the movie. It's not better. It's not better. It creates other problems. You should really see this movie on Netflix. It's stunning. But so, you know, for me to care about sustainability, it's something in the future. I mean, people don't save money for their retirement, and the retirement is when you're going to need your money the most, because you can't make money, and if you don't have money, and then you're totally screwed. So how do you expect them to care about the sea, the number of fish in the North Sea? So I think that the only way to really get consumers to actually behave in a sustainable way is going to be through very strong regulation. That's one element, which I know is a big no-no in the US. People don't like regulation. And the other element is if the plant-based food companies are able to produce alternatives that are as healthy and as tasty as the original things they're replacing, then we actually stand a chance. And listen, I've had Impossible Burgers, I've had Beyond Meat, and it's not a hamburger. And my family's from Argentina. I eat beef, you know, like that's part of our patrimony. And so I'll replace the beef because I also care about the environment, but give me something viable. So hopefully technology companies are able to create that change for us.
So I guess, so I hear you. And I know that there's a little bit of the discrepancy, and right, it's, I think, difficult for the average consumer to also navigate all the claims, right? It's complex. You need a PhD to understand, right? You walk the egg aisle. It's like impossible. Like, this one's free range, this one's right cage free. It's like the sea of claims. You're just trying to get in, right? Make a purchase and get out is complicated. I guess as we think about how especially companies can better shape and drive responsible choice, I guess, are there other movements or other I guess I'll use the word movements that we can draw from to help try to positively drive better consumption behaviors or more responsible consumption behaviors. I don't know if you were on if you had joined just yet when Chris shared, right, like the Tide Pods as the example, right? If we look at the life cycle assessment of the environmental footprint of the Tide Pod, when it hits the consumer use, is really where the heavy footprint comes in. Same thing with denim and jeans, right? It's really from washing your jeans, right? That's why Levi's made it cool to not wash our jeans, because they saw that too with their own assessment. So what's your take? Is there ways that we can more positively try to influence the choice of influence more responsible choice?
So I think that there's multiple ways to do it. I think you can find individual examples here and there, but in order to make it like a mass consumer thing, I think two things have to happen. First of all, people respond to incentives. I'm a psychologist by training, but my economist friends are right. People respond to incentives. If the right incentives are in place to buy the right kind of things, people do the right. They basically they will follow. They'll buy what's cheaper. You know, when the sustainable alternative is the cheaper one, that drives demand. So that's one place it's going to happen. Another place it's going to happen is through sort of carefully architecting decision situations in such a way that those situations favor those more sustainable products. Let me give you a really, really, really caricature of an example. Okay. You know, people spend, when they look at a grocery aisle, they spend 6 seconds on average looking at looking at the aisle, right? Which suggests they're doing one of two things or a combination of both. Either they're looking for a specific brand and just pulling it off, or they're making whatever choice is the easiest choice. Okay, and so they're looking for some heuristic way to choose. Something that's at eye level is much easier for me to see and to process, and it draws my attention, or end of aisle draws my attention much more than something that's in the shelf below it, or two shelves below it, or not in the end of aisle. If you put the sustainable products in those places where people are naturally paying attention, you're going to naturally get those products to be more likely to be considered, and therefore more likely to be purchased. Right, so that's kind of an example of how you would architect situations. You know, Google does it in the Google Kitchen. They didn't want their employees eating so much dessert, so to get the dessert, you actually have to go around the corner and like pass some column. Right, so what they did, they didn't say, hey, you're not going to have dessert. They didn't put a sign saying, hey, if you have dessert, you're going to get fat and it's bad, and you know, like your insurance rates are going to go up, and you know, all kinds of bad things are going to happen. They just made desserts harder to reach. And so I think if we privilege sustainable products in the environments in which people are making decisions at the expense of those products that are not sustainable, right, then you would be moving the needle on those products being purchased without having to engage in this really expensive process of convincing people that sustainability matters, that this is a good product for sustainability, and so on and so forth. Nothing is more expensive than marketing, right? And so, you know, but we can get around it by changing the situation in which people make decisions.
Thank you. I want to open up for questions. I'm mindful of time.
Yeah, I apologize, guys. It's when I agreed to do this, I thought it was on a Tuesday, and I teach on Wednesday afternoons. So I'm giving my students a bit of an extended break in order to be able to join. It's not lack of interest. It's just, you know, absent-minded professor planning.
Yeah. Does anybody want to jump in and ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. Maggie, may I?
Yes, of course. Yes,
Hi.
please.
Thank you for being here with us tonight.
Pleasure, Jordan.
I wanted to ask Chris a question. Last evening, I had dinner with the CEO of a major department store here in New York City and the retired CEO of Brooks Brothers. And so obviously the conversation turned to marketing. And my question to them was, how do they manage to sustain themselves through the COVID crisis without customers coming into the actual stores? And they told me in the one case, 90% of the sales during COVID were online. And then told me something that was new to me, that over 30% of everything bought online is returned. So my question to you is, obviously to me, this is a generational thing. I can't conceive of buying a pair of shoes or being fitted for a suit online. It just doesn't make sense to me. Yet the younger generation seems very comfortable with this. Does this presage what we're going to see in the future? Will we see more Amazon and less physical stores?
Chris, I
Yes.
think
Yes is the short
Chris,
answer.
yes.
And I'm sure Jonathan has a lot of insight on consumer mindset and where it's shifting. But yeah, I mean, you know, pick your cliche, but you know, this has accelerated the trend from, you know, offline to online. You know, I think it will always be a hybrid, but it has disrupted companies' assumptions and business models and where they've made capital expenditures, and they're needing to shift. So I think the short answer is yes, but I'm sure Jonathan can also talk about what's happened in terms of consumer mindset and behavior in particular to drive it, accept it, adopt it.
I mean, I'll share a thought and then I'll have to roll off. My apologies again for that. I think, look, there's the smart retailers are gonna stop thinking of themselves as shops and start thinking of themselves as places where people can have consumer experiences. Because there's one thing that's true about the internet, is that it's not at all experiential. And so there's two kinds of goods. You know, you have search goods and experience goods. And experience goods, I can understand. I derive my utility from them through experience. That's how I assess how much I enjoy them. And so for experience goods, retailers actually have an advantage. But in order to cash on that advantage, they need to create an experience in the store that online can't have by definition, because of the medium that is online. If the stores are just websites in 3 dimensions, then they're going to lose out. But if they reinvent themselves as being a 3-dimensional experience that you can't have online, and they actually use the online as an additional channel, right? Then what you're going to see is kind of the winners are going to be the ones that can create this kind of hybrid, kind of both online, offline, particularly for goods that are experiential goods. The other part that I think is going to become important is access to expertise. Sometimes there's a lot of user reviews online, but they have a fundamental problem, is that they're all positive. If you look at ratings, they cluster between 4.5 and 5 on a 5-point scale. And so they're not nearly as diagnostic. And so you can imagine actually in the retail space, because you're speaking to an individual, you can get some sort of more privileged information that's going to help you make decisions. But barring that, I see kind of retail that doesn't reinvent itself will end up being like Sears, right? A company that was once great and that is no longer. I wouldn't be, if I'm them, I wouldn't be afraid of online. If I'm Amazon, I would be afraid of what they can do to me, right? There's a reason why Amazon bought some physical locations, right? Because we thankfully don't live in a world that's 100% dystopic, where everything is done through computers. There are things that are still can benefit from sort of face-to-face physical situations. So that would be my take. But I'll tell you that, like, for the younger generation, this is going to get worse before it gets better in terms of how big online is going to be. And if these retailers don't hurry up, they're going to end up like, if the banks did their jobs, there wouldn't be a need for Bitcoin, right? So if they actually thought about consumer needs and met those consumer needs and anticipated what those consumer needs are, this wouldn't have been such a crisis, right? They should have been selling online before and taken advantage of it before. They just didn't, because they were asleep at the wheel, like a lot of big established companies are.
Thank you.
Balor, I have to roll. I apologize. This was fun. Chris, it's nice meeting you. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to hear your talk. But I have I actually, apropos being online versus in person, I have my graduate students meet me in my backyard because it's just not the same. And so hopefully one day we can do this all in New York, the rejuvenated, renewed New York post.
Or your backyard.
Or my backyard, even better. I have plenty of space. We have plenty of space to social distance. Maggie, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Maggie, can I get a question in for Chris on banking?
Yes, of course, of course.
So-
I unfortunately am going to have to drop too, because I just have a client call coming up, but I just want to say thank you for having us, and thank you
Pleasure.
for
Thank you.
organizing us. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much
Maggie.
for being with us. Yes.
And also,
Thanks, Maggie.
Mr. Del Vecchio is has done a lot of great work with us. So delighted to hear that you are having great debates about fashion. See, hi.
Well, Laura, great to see you. Chris, wanted to ask you a question about the role of the Chinese banks in supporting the regime in North Korea. We know that the Chinese banks have been violating all of the bans that the other countries, the democratic countries, have put on dealing with North Korea. What would be the effect if the United States and its allies were to take some retaliatory action against Chinese banks for breaking the rules as far as dealing with North Korea?
I think they'd be probably pretty significant based on how we've seen China respond, either proactively or reactively to anything that questions their sort of national interest. So I mean, look, I think that this is a simplistic statement, but I think that China is ready to use the teeth and the strength of the value of its domestic market in its own diplomacy and the projection of its own policies. So that's what I would anticipate.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Chris, for your time and a wonderful, phenomenal insight towards what's going on in the corporate world. And thank you so much, everyone, for your joining this session. And I'll hand it over to President Gerard for closing.
Thank you, Balor, again.
Thank you.
It's not for no reason we call her Madam Secretary. She's spectacular, and she does a great job, and she has done a lot to bring a whole new dynamic to the Rotary Club of New York. We're very grateful and proud of her. I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight. I have to apologize. I got here late. I had some legal issues I had to deal with, finish a decision from a trial I had this afternoon. But I want to thank you all for being here. And next week, I understand we have as a guest, Andreas had told me, we have invited someone who is a well-known expert on the future of restaurants in New York City and running a business in New York City. And so this will tie into what we all hope our cities will become, our vision for the future post-COVID. So it should be exciting, and we urge you to be here with us. Andreas, anything you want to add before we sign off for tonight?
No, not really, Gerard. Thank you so much for what you just said. We have Christian Mombelli next week, who is the operation manager of Il Molino restaurants, and he's gonna tell everything about himself and how he sees the restaurants in New York City to proceed as he sees it, the future. It's surely something that we all are concerned about, where are restaurants going, the hospitality industry as a whole, hotels and all that. And he's gonna give us a great insight on that. He has been a longtime friend of mine, and he's gonna give us a great insight on that. He's also a master sommelier, so he might give us even some hints on some wines. But long story short, back to you, Gerard. We are done.
Thank you, Andreas, and we invite everyone to participate with us next week. We all understand an international city like New York, without restaurants and the hospitality industry, has no future. So it's something that concerns all of us. One of the reasons we live here is because we have access to some of the greatest cuisine in the world at our fingertips. Without that, we'd have to give it a second thought. But in any event, thank you again, everyone, for being with us. And thank you for being part of Rotary. Please stay safe. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye. Thanks all. See ya.
Thank you to our guests again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.